Savannah is a city built on layers. It's a place where history doesn't just stay in books. It bleeds through the sidewalks, hangs heavy in the humid air, and wraps around you like the Spanish moss that drapes from every oak tree. It's beautiful, certainly, with its cobblestone streets, historic squares, and grand antebellum homes. But it is a beauty that feels heavy, weighted down by everything that has happened here. At 39 years old, I've spent most of my adult life working restoration jobs, fixing old homes, repairing historic landmarks, breathing new life into structures that have stood for a century or more. I know wood, stone, glass, and mortar. I know how buildings settle, how they creak, how they breathe. Or at least I thought I did. I got into this line of work almost by accident. After my parents passed away in a car crash when I was in my early 20s, I found myself adrift, looking for something solid and something that wouldn't change or disappear overnight. I started working with a local contractor who specialized in historic preservation, and I discovered quickly that I had a knack for it. There is a specific kind of peace you find in taking something broken, something neglected, and returning it to what it was meant to be. I learned to read a house the way other people read books. A crack in the foundation tells a story of shifting earth. A patch of discoloration on the ceiling speaks of long-forgotten leaks or poor repairs. The way a door sticks or swings open on its own isn't magic. It's physics, humidity, wood expanding and contracting with the seasons. Or so I always told myself. The job offer came through a private historical society mailed directly to my office. It was printed on thick, cream-colored paper, formal and slightly old-fashioned in its wording. It wasn't a big contract. Nothing that would make me rich, but it paid well enough, and the location was intriguing. An old caretaker's lodge attached to what used to be the Davenport orphanage, located in the oldest, quietest ward of the historic district. The orphanage itself had been closed since the late 1940s, condemned and locked away behind high iron gates and overgrown hedges. It was one of those places locals knew existed but rarely spoke about, even less frequently visited. Stories circulated, as they always do around abandoned places, mostly about fires, sickness, and the sad fate of children left to the care of strangers in a different, harder time. The lodge, smaller and separate from the main building, was structurally sound, but had been empty for decades. My task was simple, according to the letter. Assess the damage, document what needed repair, check for water intrusion or termites, and secure the building against further decay. They wanted it preserved, they said, for future heritage projects and possible tours. It required someone who could work alone, someone who wouldn't mind the isolation or the age of the property. I was the perfect fit. I've always been comfortable alone. I'm a man who likes his own company, likes the rhythm of work without interruption, likes the silence that allows you to focus entirely on the task at hand. I don't scare easily, and I certainly don't believe in ghosts. I've worked in graveyards, old hospitals, crumbling mansions, and Civil War forts. I've heard every creak, groan, whistle, and thump an old building can make, and I've always had a logical explanation ready. I arrived just before noon on a Tuesday. The heat was already thick and wet, sticking my linen shirt to my back within minutes of stepping out of my truck. Savannah heat isn't like heat anywhere else. It presses down on you, heavy and tangible, filling your lungs with moisture, making every movement feel like you're walking through water. The neighborhood was beautiful, but strangely silent. The houses were grand, with tall columns and wide porches, painted in soft pastels of blue, pink, and yellow. But they sat far back from the street, hidden behind walls of ivy, magnolia bushes, and ancient live oaks, whose branches reached across the road to touch each other, creating a tunnel of green shade. There were no people walking, no dogs barking, no cars passing. Just the hum of insects, hidden in the undergrowth, and the soft, constant rustle of leaves in the heavy breeze that drifted in from the nearby river. It was like stepping onto a movie set, or perhaps stepping back 50 years in time. The iron gates marking the boundary of the orphanage grounds were tall, black, and topped with sharp spikes. They stood slightly ajar, held open by thick vines that had woven themselves through the bars over decades. A brass plaque, tarnished and almost illegible, was bolted to one side. Davenport Home for Children Est 1872. I pushed the gate open further, the hinges screaming in protest, a high-pitched shriek that echoed down the empty street and then was swallowed instantly by the trees. I hauled my gear, toolbox, heavy leather bag, cooler, and a large lantern I always carried for inspections, through the gap and onto the property. The grounds were wild. It hadn't been maintained in a very long time. What used to be lawns and gardens were now thickets of tall grass, briars, and weeds. Old pathways, once neatly laid with brick, were cracked, broken, and buried under layers of dead leaves and fallen branches. The lodge sat right at the back of the property, close to a line of very old live oaks that separated the caretaker's residence from the abandoned main building. And that building, the orphanage itself, it loomed behind the trees, massive and imposing. 3 stories of red brick, dark and stained by rain and time, with a steep slate roof and tall, narrow windows all boarded up with weathered planks. It looked less like a building and more like a sleeping beast waiting to wake up. It dominated the landscape, casting a long, cold shadow over everything around it, including the lodge. Even in the bright midday sun, the area around the orphanage felt dim, cool, and unwelcoming. I turned my attention away from it, focusing instead on the job at hand. The lodge was a 2-story wooden structure, painted a faded yellow that had turned gray with age and mildew, with a wide wraparound porch, supported by slender columns. It was charming, in a sad, neglected sort of way. It had a steep gable roof and tall, narrow windows that looked out over the overgrown grounds toward the city skyline, barely visible through the trees. I unlocked the front door using the heavy iron key that had been mailed to me. It turned in the lock with a stiff, grinding sound, and when I pushed, the door swung inward slowly, groaning on hinges that hadn't moved in years. I stepped inside, and the atmosphere changed instantly. The air was cool, noticeably cooler than the humid heat outside, and it smelled intensely of dust, old paper, dry rot, and wet earth. It wasn't a bad smell exactly, it was just heavy. It smelled like time had stopped here and decided to stay, accumulating in layers, just like the dust covering every surface. The interior was largely empty. A few broken chairs stacked in a corner, a rotting wooden table, peeling wallpaper that curled away from the plaster in long strips, and a wide staircase leading up to the second floor. The floorboards were made of beautiful heart pine, dark and dense, though now covered in grit and debris. Sunlight filtered in through the high windows, cutting through the gloom in solid beams, illuminating thousands of dust motes, dancing endlessly in the air. I spent the first few hours going room to room, checking the floors, tapping the walls with a small hammer to find hollow spots or rot, taking notes and photographs on my tablet. Everything was in surprisingly good condition, considering how long it had been abandoned. The wood was solid. The roof structure looked intact from the attic I crawled into. The fireplaces were clear of debris, and there were no signs of animal infestation. Odd, I thought, because usually empty houses are full of squirrels, raccoons, or birds. Here there was nothing. No nests, no droppings, no chewed wood. It felt sanitized, preserved. It felt sturdy. It felt safe. By late afternoon, I had set up a small workstation in the main room downstairs, which served as a combined living room and dining area. I brought in my cooler with food and water, a portable radio I kept mostly for background noise, and spread my tools out on the floor. I planned to stay here for the week. Driving back and forth from the city wasn't practical, and honestly, I liked the quiet. I was used to being alone. In fact, I preferred it. People bring noise, complications, and expectations. Old buildings just bring history. As the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in shades of purple and deep orange, the light inside the lodge changed drastically. The bright and cheerful illumination of the afternoon faded quickly, replaced by long, stretching shadows that reached out from the corners and under the furniture. The temperature dropped noticeably, even though it was still mid-May. A chill settled into the room, seeping up through the floorboards and down from the high ceiling. I turned on the large kerosene lamp I had brought, placing it on the center of the table. It cast a warm, yellow glow that pushed the dark back just a few feet, leaving the rest of the room in deep, shifting shadow. Outside, the sounds of the day changed too. The busy hum of insects quieted down, replaced by the slower, deeper sounds of night creatures waking up. Crickets started their endless chirping. Frogs began to croak from somewhere near the overgrown fountain I had passed earlier. And the wind moved differently now, blowing harder, making the Spanish moss stream like hair and scraping the heavy branches of the oaks against the side of the house with a dry, scratching sound. That was when I first heard it. John? Soft, gentle female. I looked up from my notebook, pen hovering over the paper. I listened carefully, my head tilted slightly to one side. The wind rustled the leaves outside. A floorboard creaked somewhere upstairs. The house settling, just as they all do. Nothing else. I shook my head, rubbing my eyes. I was tired. It had been a long drive, a long day of climbing, lifting, and inspecting. My ears were tired from the noise of travel. my mind focused entirely on the job. Old houses play tricks on you. Sound travels strangely through empty rooms. Echoes bounce off hard surfaces, reverberate down hallways, creating voices where there are none. It's a psychological phenomenon I know well. Pareidolia. The human brain is wired to find patterns, to find meaning, to find faces and voices in random noise and light. It's an evolutionary survival trait. We hear a rustle, and our brain shouts, predator or person, just to be safe. I went back to writing my notes. Foundation solid, sills need treatment, roof shingles intact but aged, windows require reglazing and counterweights repaired. 10 minutes later it came again, louder this time, closer, right behind my shoulder. John Alcorn, we've been waiting for you. My blood ran cold. It wasn't random noise. It wasn't the wind or the creaking wood. It was clear. It was distinct. It had tone, inflection, personality. And it called my full name. A name nobody here knew. Nobody knew I was here except the board of the Historical Society, and they were miles away in an office downtown. I hadn't told anyone else where I was going. I kept my work private, my movements quiet. I stood up slowly, placing the pen down quietly so as not to make a sound. I looked around the room, turning a full circle, empty. The door was locked and bolted. The windows were sealed shut with paint and age. The fireplace was cold and blocked with an iron screen. I was the only living thing inside these walls. John, come upstairs, please. It's so cold up here. The voice sounded young now, like a child, sad, desperate, shaking slightly as if shivering. I walked to the bottom of the staircase and looked up into the darkness above. The banister was made of dark walnut, carved with intricate scrolls and patterns, curving up and out of sight into the gloom. The shadows at the top were thick, black, impenetrable, swallowing the light from my lamp completely. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud, too harsh in the quiet house. It cracked slightly, betraying the fear I was trying desperately to suppress. Silence. Absolute, heavy silence. Then from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floorboards beneath my feet, from the ceiling above, from the very air filling my lungs, a chorus of voices rose up. Men, women, children, old, young, happy, sad, angry, pleading, whispering, shouting, hundreds of them. "John, help us over here. No, here, listen to me. I remember you. You know me. Don't you? John, John, John." They called my name over and over again, layered on top of each other, overlapping, rising in volume until it sounded like a crowd standing right next to me, pressing in close, surrounding me. I could hear different accents, different ages, different emotions in every single voice. Some sounded angry, some terrified, some just incredibly lonely. I backed away from the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. I grabbed the lantern, holding it high, trying to shine the light into every corner, trying to see something, anything that could explain it. But there was nothing there. Just empty space. Just dust and shadows and old wood. And then, cutting through the noise, sharp and clear as a bell, I recognized one of the voices. Johnny, don't leave me here. You promised you'd stay. My breath caught in my throat. My knees nearly gave out. That voice. I knew that voice. I knew the way it went high on the last word. I knew the slight rasp at the end of every sentence from the sickness she had. It belonged to my sister, Clara. Clara was 4 years younger than me. She had been sick her whole life, weak and fragile, prone to fevers and chills. When we were children and during one particularly bad winter, our parents had to travel out of state to help a relative who had been in an accident. They left us in the care of a neighbor, but that night the neighbor fell asleep early, and Clara had gotten worse. I was 12 years old. I sat by her bed, holding her hand, promising her she would be okay, promising I wouldn't leave her side. But I did. I fell asleep too. And when I woke up, she was gone. I hadn't thought of her voice in years. I had buried that memory deep, locked it away behind walls I thought were impenetrable. Because the guilt was something I couldn't carry. It was the defining regret of my life. The reason I liked fixing things. The reason I needed to make things right. But here it was. Clear as day. Perfectly replicated. Every nuance, every pause, every inflection exactly as I remembered it. Johnny, it hurts. Come find me. It's dark and cold, just like before. Stop it, I whispered, pressing my hands against my ears, though it did no good. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my head, inside the room, vibrating through the wood itself. Stop it. You aren't her. You can't be her. We are whoever you need us to be, the chorus answered, hundreds of voices blending into one deep, rushing sound like water. We are whoever you miss. We are whoever you regret. Come find us, John. Come stay. I stumbled back until I hit the heavy oak table, knocking over my water bottle. It crashed to the floor, the plastic splitting open, water spilling across the dusty planks. The sound of it breaking seemed to snap the spell instantly. All the voices stopped, cut off clean, like someone had pulled a plug from a socket. 1 second there was a screaming, pleading, whispering crowd. The next, there was nothing. Silence rushed back in, heavier and more terrifying than the noise had been. It pressed against my ears, painful and absolute. I stood there in the flickering light, sweating, trembling, my hands shaking uncontrollably, trying desperately to rationalize what had just happened. I told myself I was tired. I told myself the heat was getting to me. I told myself this was just the stress of the job, the isolation, the history of the place. Playing games with my head, I told myself that my own guilt and grief had manifested into auditory hallucinations because I was alone in a sad old house. But deep down, I knew better. I knew the difference between my own mind and something else forcing its way in. I knew that my memories were private. My memories were mine alone. Nothing should have been able to reach inside my head and pull out the sound of my dead sister's voice. I remembered what the foreman of my last job had muttered when I mentioned I was taking this contract. That ward, that whole stretch of land, it holds on to things, the old orphanage especially. Best not to listen to anything that talks to you after dark. Nothing alive stays there after sunset. And the things that do, they aren't friendly. They want company. I had laughed at him then. I wasn't laughing now. I spent the rest of the night sitting at the table, eyes fixed on the staircase, lantern burning bright beside me. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard them whispering my name. Every time the house settled or creaked or popped, I flinched, expecting to see faces materialize from the woodwork or hands reach out from the shadows. I kept a heavy crowbar within arm's reach, though I knew perfectly well that a piece of steel wouldn't help me against something I couldn't hit or see. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. I watched the eastern horizon through the tall window, waiting for the first hint of gray. When the pale light finally crept through the glass, flooding the room with soft, safe illumination, the tension in my chest loosened just a fraction. The shadows retreated to their corners, shrinking away from the light. The house looked ordinary again, old, dusty, empty, but ordinary. The oppressive weight that had filled the air all night seemed to lift, drifting out through the cracks in the walls like mist. I stood up, my legs stiff and aching from sitting in one position for so long, and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was rising fast, painting the tops of the oak trees in brilliant gold. The birds were singing loudly, cheerfully, a stark contrast to the mournful sounds of the night. The grounds looked peaceful, almost welcoming in the morning light. The massive bulk of the old orphanage behind us was still dark and imposing, but it no longer felt like it was watching me. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, fresh air that drifted in through the gap under the window frame. My shirt was soaked through with sweat, clinging to my skin, and my mouth felt dry and tasted of copper and dust. I looked down at the floor where I had spilled my water hours ago. The puddle had dried completely, leaving only a darker patch on the pine boards, a faint ghost of the chaos that had unfolded here. For a moment, I considered packing everything up, loading my truck, and driving straight back to town. I could call the Historical Society, tell them the structure was unsound, tell them there was water damage or rot or anything else that would justify walking away. I had done my due diligence. I had seen enough to know this place wasn't just a building. It was a vessel, a reservoir of pain, of loss, of things that didn't belong in the world of the living. But as I looked around the room, my eyes fell on the heavy wooden mantelpiece over the fireplace. I hadn't paid it much attention yesterday, too busy checking structural details. But now in the clear morning light, I saw it properly. It was carved from the same dark walnut as the staircase banister. Intricate scrollwork and floral patterns winding across the surface. And right in the center, just above the firebox, carved deep into the wood so it would never fade or flake away, were words written in an old flowery script. I walked over slowly, my bare feet making no sound on the dusty floorboards, and ran my fingers lightly over the letters. They were worn smooth by time, by hands touching them over decades, maybe over a century. They do not call to find you. They call so you will find them. I traced the words again, reading them aloud in a whisper. They do not call to find you. They call so you will find them. It made sense now. Everything that had happened last night clicked into place like a puzzle falling together. They hadn't called my name by accident. They hadn't mimicked my sister's voice just to scare me. They knew exactly who I was before I even stepped out of my truck. They knew my history, my grief, my guilt, my deepest, most buried regrets. Restoration isn't just about fixing wood and stone, I realized. It's about uncovering what was hidden. It's about touching the fabric of the past and waking it up. I had come here to save this building, to preserve it, to give it a future. But in doing so, I had made myself visible. I had made myself available. I thought about the voices, hundreds of them, men, women, children, all calling for help, all calling to be found, all trapped here, bound to this place, unable to leave, unable to move on, waiting for someone, anyone, who would listen, who would acknowledge them, who would finally see them. And they had chosen me. Why? Because I fix things, because I listen to buildings, because I care about what was broken and forgotten. To them, I wasn't just a contractor, I was a chance. I walked to the front door and unlocked it, pulling it wide open to let the fresh morning breeze sweep through the house, carrying away the stale, heavy air of the night. I stood on the wide porch, leaning against the railing, looking out over the overgrown lawn toward the high iron gates. I told myself I would leave. I told myself I was crazy for even considering staying another hour. But as I stood there, the fear began to mix with something else. A strange, stubborn determination. If I left now, nothing would change. This house would stay locked up. These things would stay trapped here, screaming into the dark forever, never heard, never helped, never allowed to rest. And something else, something darker, deeper down, held me there. The way they had used Clara's voice, the way they had known exactly what buttons to push. It proved they were connected to me somehow. It proved that whatever was happening here wasn't random, it was personal. If I left, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what they wanted, wondering why me, wondering if they would follow me, if they would keep calling my name no matter how far I ran. I turned back to the interior of the lodge, looking at the empty rooms, the staircase leading up into the quiet, the fireplace with its ominous warning carved into the wood. I grabbed my notebook from the table and opened it to a fresh page. I didn't write about foundations or shingles or wood rot. I wrote down everything I remembered from the night, every voice, every word, every sensation. I wrote down the warning. They do not call to find you. They call so you will find them. And then I wrote my own note underneath it. Voices call my name after dark. None of them belong to the living, but they belong here, and they are waiting for me to answer. I looked at my watch. It was just past 8 in the morning. I had roughly 12 hours until sunset. 12 hours until they woke up again. 12 hours until the calling started all over again. I wasn't ready to leave, not yet. I had come here to assess the damage, but I was beginning to understand that the damage wasn't in the walls or the roof or the floors. The damage was in the history this place held. The damage was in the spirits trapped within it. And I was the only one who had walked through that gate in a very long time who was willing to listen. I closed the notebook and set it back on the table. I picked up my hammer and my tape measure. I had work to do. But this time it wasn't just carpentry. I walked toward the staircase, looking up into the shadows where the voices had come from, where my sister's voice had echoed so clearly just hours ago. I took a step up, then another. "I'm here," I said aloud, my voice steady and clear in the silent house. "I'm listening, and I'm going to find out exactly who you are and what happened here." Somewhere above me, a floorboard had creaked softly. Not the settling of wood, but a slow, deliberate step. And this time I didn't flinch. This time I didn't run. I was John Alcorn. I fix things. And right now, the thing that needed fixing wasn't the house. It was whatever was inside it. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step letting out a long, groaning protest that sounded less like wood settling and more like something waking up. The air grew colder as I ascended, the temperature dropping sharply, as if a window had been left open in the middle of winter. The walls here were covered in the same faded wallpaper as downstairs, once a rich, deep green pattern, now bleached to a sickly gray by decades of shade and damp. But there was something different about the texture of it. As I ran my hand along the banister for balance, my fingers brushed the wall, and I realized the paper wasn't just peeling. It looked as though it had been scratched at, clawed from the inside out. Thin vertical marks ran down the length of the hallway, faint but unmistakable, like hundreds of tiny fingernails dragging against the surface. At the top of the landing, the space opened into a long corridor that ran the entire length of the house. Doors lined both sides, all closed, all painted the same dull white, their doorknobs tarnished black. Sunlight filtered in from a large window at the far end, casting long, rectangular shadows across the floorboards, making it look less like a hallway and more like a cage with bars of light and dark. I stood still for a moment, listening. After the chaos of the night, the silence up here was heavy, expectant. It wasn't empty. It was full of held breath. I could feel eyes on me, dozens, hundreds of them, watching from behind every closed door, from every crack in the woodwork, from the darkness under the eaves. "I'm here," I repeated, my voice stronger this time, bouncing off the high ceiling and echoing back to me softly. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I just want to know what happened." No answer, not yet. They were waiting to see what I would do. They were testing me just as they had tested me with the voices. I started with the first door on the left. The handle resisted at first, stiff with disuse, but it turned with a sharp click, and the door swung inward with a soft squeak. This room had clearly been a bedroom, likely the caretaker's private quarters. It was larger than the others, with a fireplace of its own and a small closet built into the wall. But unlike the barren rooms downstairs, this one was full of things. Not furniture, but paper, stacked against every wall, piled on the floor, tucked into corners and shelves, were boxes, binders, ledgers, and stacks of loose paper tied together with fraying string. This was the archive. the memory of the place. I stepped inside, my boots crunching softly on the layer of dust and dried leaves that covered the floor. The air smelled different here. Not just dust and rot, but ink, old paper, and something sharp and chemical like old medicine or formaldehyde. It smelled like records. It smelled like truth. I walked over to the nearest stack and knelt down, brushing the thick layer of dust off the top ledger. The cover was thick leather, cracked and dry, embossed with gold lettering that had long since faded. Davenport Home Admissions and Disposal, 1922 to 1938. My hands moved carefully as I opened it. The pages were thick, yellowed parchment, the handwriting inside neat, precise, and terrifyingly clinical. Names, dates, ages, conditions. And in the final column, a single word repeated over and over again. Page after page. Removed. I read a few entries, my stomach twisting tighter with every line. Sarah M., age 7, orphaned by fever, condition quiet withdrawn, reports of imaginary friends, and talking to walls. Removed. March 14th, 1923. Thomas H., age 9, brought in from the coast. Violent tendencies. Claims voices tell him to hurt others. Removed. July 2nd, 1925. Clara B., age 6, sickly, bedridden, refuses food unless spoken to by the others. Removed. January 30th, 1927. My breath hitched. Clara B., the same age my sister had been when she died. The same description, sickly, talking to people who weren't there. It wasn't my Clara, it couldn't be. But it was another Clara, another child defined by what she heard, defined by the voices that called to her. I understood then why they had chosen me. It wasn't just because I fixed things. It was because I already knew what it was like to be called. I already knew what it was like to carry the guilt of not being able to help. I moved from book to book, scanning the entries, the timeline stretching forward through the decades. The pattern remained the same. Children came, children who were different, children who heard things, saw things, knew things they shouldn't. They stayed for a while, were observed, were documented, and then they were removed. There was never a destination listed, never a grave site, never a note saying they were adopted or transferred or died, just removed. And then I found the final log, tucked at the very bottom of a box near the window, smaller than the others, bound in black cloth. Final records, 1946 to 1948. Warden's personal notes. The handwriting here was different, messier, shaky. Written by a man who was terrified, writing fast in the flickering light of a candle. I sat cross-legged on the floor, opening it carefully, feeling like I was holding something alive and dangerous in my hands. They come here because they are sensitive, the first entry began. We thought it was the location. We thought the river, the marsh gas, the old burial grounds nearby. We thought it made them sick. We thought we were curing them. But I know better now. We didn't bring them here to heal them. We brought them here because they are the only ones who can hear it. And it needs voices to speak through. My skin crawled. I looked up from the page, instinctively glancing at the closed door, at the walls, at the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. The voices aren't ghosts, the warden wrote further down. They aren't the spirits of the dead. That is what we told ourselves to sleep at night. That is what the society tells the public. But they are older than this city, older than the pines. They are echoes, resonances of things that never lived, things that exist only as sound and hunger in the spaces between the world. They cannot manifest, they cannot touch, they cannot leave this ground unless they have a vessel, unless they have a voice to speak with and a body to walk in. I remembered the night before, the way they sounded like Clara, the way they sounded like me, like anyone they wanted. We are whoever you need us to be. The children, they hear them first. The voices whisper secrets, promises, memories that aren't theirs. The children believe they are helping. They open the door. And once the door is open, the thing steps in. It changes them. It makes them like itself, empty, just sound. We remove them before they can spread it further. We lock the place down. But it is never enough. It always waits for someone new to come and listen. The last entry was dated October 12th, 1948. The handwriting was barely legible, scrawled wildly across the page, ink smudged as if written while running. It knows I am writing. It knows I am leaving. It calls to me now too. It uses the voice of my dead wife. It says it has been waiting for me. It says the lodge is not a place to stay. It is a trap baited with memory and grief. Whoever comes here next, do not answer. Do not listen. If you hear your name, run. It doesn't want help. It wants out. And it will use everything you love, everything you regret, everything you miss to make you open the door. The book slipped from my hands, landing softly on the pile of papers. The moral dilemma I thought I had, helping trapped souls versus leaving them be, was a lie, a trick. There were no trapped souls here. There was only a hunger, a predatory ancient thing that fed on empathy, on connection, on the human need to be heard. And I had walked right into it. I had stood at the bottom of the stairs and shouted that I was listening. I had walked up here willingly, drawn by the memory of my sister, drawn by my own desire to fix what was broken. Suddenly, the light in the room shifted. The sun that had been streaming through the window vanished, blocked out by something large and dark moving outside. I heard the sound of wings, massive heavy wings beating against the air, circling the house. Then the voices started again. But this time it wasn't a chorus. This time it was just one voice, clear, sweet, and heartbreakingly familiar. "Johnny, you found the book. Good boy. You always were so smart, so helpful." It was Clara, exactly as she had sounded in my worst nightmares, in my quietest moments of grief. I scrambled backward until my back hit the wall, eyes fixed on the open doorway. "You understand now, don't you?" she said, her voice moving from the hallway to the top of the stairs, drifting closer, floating through the wood itself. "We aren't trapped, Johnny. We are free. We are everything you remember, everything you miss, everything you wish you could have again. You don't have to be sad anymore. You don't have to carry the guilt. Just open the door. Just listen completely. Just say yes. I looked at the black book lying on the floor. It will use everything you love to make you open the door. I know you aren't her, I said, my voice shaking but firm. You sound like her. You know what she said, but you aren't her. She wouldn't want me to come with her like this. She wouldn't want me to disappear. The voice changed instantly. The sweetness vanished, replaced by something cold, sharp, and furious. 1,000 voices merged into one deep, rushing roar that vibrated in my teeth and bones. You came here to fix things. You came here to be needed. We need you. We have been calling for 100 years, and no one listened until you. You belong here. You are one of us already. The walls began to change. The peeling wallpaper didn't just look like scratches anymore. It looked like mouths, opening and closing, forming words, screaming silently. The floorboards rippled beneath me like water. The boxes of papers toppled over, spilling their contents, and I saw that the writing on the pages was moving, shifting, spelling out my name over and over again in thousands of different handwritings. I realized the escalation now. It wasn't about scaring me away. It was about wearing me down. Night 1. Mimicry of loved ones bait the hook. Day 2. Reveal history, justify the call, make me feel responsible. Now aggression and truth force the choice. Join us or be consumed. The door to the room slammed shut hard, locking me inside. The light from the window died completely, covered by whatever was circling outside. The only illumination came from the walls themselves, glowing with a sickly pale luminescence. And from the darkness of the hallway, right outside the door, something heavy dragged itself across the floor. Scrape, scrape, scrape. He was coming for me, not to kill me, but to add my voice to the chorus, to use my face, my memories, my grief, to call the next poor soul who walked through those iron gates, looking for something to fix. I looked around the room, panic rising in my chest. There was no other exit. The window was too high, too small, and led to a drop of 30 feet onto hard earth. I was trapped. Then I saw it. Carved into the frame of the window, small and barely visible under layers of paint. A message left by the warden. The last thing he did before he ran. It is only sound. It can only go where sound goes. Silence is the only lock. Silence, everything it did relied on sound. It called me, it mimicked me, it roared at me. It existed as noise, as vibration, as things heard but never seen. I remembered rule number 4 from the previous place I had been. Ironically, the lesson I had learned in the Minnesota woods a lifetime ago, though I didn't know it then. If you are still, you are part of the scenery. Here the rule was different, but the principle was the same. If you are silent, you do not exist to it. The dragging sound stopped right outside the door. The handle began to turn slowly, creaking. I didn't have tools. I didn't have weapons. I had nothing but my own will and my knowledge of how buildings work, how materials block things out. I grabbed the thickest ledger from the floor, the heavy leather one, and pressed it tight against the gap at the bottom of the door. I took stacks of loose paper and wadded them tight, shoving them into the keyhole, into the cracks around the frame. I pressed my hands hard against my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, and forced myself into a state of absolute, total quiet. I stopped breathing. I stopped moving. I stopped thinking words or sentences or memories. I emptied my mind completely, turning myself into nothing more than an object, wood and stone and silence. The door burst open. I felt the rush of cold air. I felt the pressure change in the room, heavy and crushing. I heard the roar of 1,000 voices right in front of my face, screaming my name, screaming promises, screaming threats, screaming everything I had ever feared or loved or lost. But I didn't hear them. I refused to process them. I forced my mind to be blank, dark, empty space. I visualized myself as a pillar of stone, solid, mute, deaf. The pressure built. It pressed against me, trying to find an opening, trying to find a reaction, trying to find a frequency it could latch onto. It clawed at my mind, at my memories, at my heart. It called for Clara again. It called for my parents. It called for the little boy I used to be who had failed to save his sister. And when none of those things worked, when I didn't answer, when I didn't flinch, when I remained perfectly, terrifyingly silent, the pressure began to recede. The voices turned to confusion, then to anger, then to frustration. No, answer us. You came to listen. You came to help. Come back. And then, just as quickly as it had arrived, it was gone. The cold vanished. The light returned. The walls stopped moving. The floor settled. I stayed frozen for a long time after, trembling violently, gasping for air I hadn't realized I was holding. When I finally opened my eyes, the room was just a room again, full of old paper, dust, and sunlight. I stood up slowly, my legs weak and rubbery. I walked to the doorway and looked out into the hall. It was empty, just long shadows and old wood. I looked back at the pile of books, at the black warden's log, at the truth I had uncovered. I hadn't saved the ghosts, because there was nothing to save. But I had saved myself, and I realized the final terrifying truth about this place. The ending wasn't about submission or joining them. It was about rejection. It was about proving that I was stronger than my grief, stronger than my memories, stronger than the things that called to me from the dark. I walked down the stairs, step by step, carrying the black book with me. I walked through the empty rooms, through the heavy air, out the front door, and onto the porch. The sun was beginning to set again, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn toward the iron gates. Behind me, inside the lodge, silence reigned supreme. But I knew it wouldn't last. I knew that as long as this building stood, as long as these grounds remained untouched, it would wait. It would gather strength. It would collect voices. And the next time, it would choose someone who wasn't strong enough to stay silent. I got into my truck and started the engine. I didn't look back. I didn't plan to ever return. But as I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The lodge stood there, silent and gray. And in every window I saw faces pressed against the glass, hundreds of them, all watching me leave, all opening their mouths at the exact same time. Even with the windows up, even with the engine running, even with the distance growing between us, I could hear them faintly, carried on the humid wind of Savannah. We will find another. We always find another. Come back, John. Come back. I drove for nearly an hour before I finally pulled over. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel, my knuckles white against the leather. I had left the historic district far behind, crossing into the newer, brighter parts of Savannah, where the streets were wide, the houses were modern, and the Spanish moss didn't hang like tattered curtains from every tree. But even here, with the radio playing loud static and the warm evening air blowing through the open windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still inside that lodge, that I was still standing in that hallway, listening to the walls breathe. The black cloth-bound book sat on the passenger seat, heavy and silent, its presence radiating a cold that the summer heat couldn't touch. I hadn't brought it with me as a trophy or as proof, though I knew no one would ever believe me if I tried to explain. I brought it because it was the only thing that held the truth, and because I was terrified of leaving it behind. If I'd left it on that floor, tucked away in that archive, it would have remained a secret, waiting for the next person foolish enough to look for answers. But taking it felt like carrying a piece of the infection with me. I turned off the engine and sat back, closing my eyes. I expected silence. I expected the normal, quiet hum of the world. Cars passing, birds settling for the night, the distant hum of the city. Instead, I heard breathing. Soft, rhythmic, coming from the back seat just over my shoulder. My eyes snapped open. I spun around, heart hammering, staring into the empty space behind me. Nothing, just my toolbox, my duffel bag, and the blankets I kept for camping. Empty. But the sound didn't stop. It wasn't coming from the back seat. It wasn't coming from outside the car. It was coming from inside my head. You thought leaving would make it stop? The voice was mine. Exactly my tone, my cadence, the way I spoke when I was thinking aloud. It wasn't Clara anymore. It wasn't the warden or the children or the angry roar. It had adapted. It had learned. Now that it couldn't use my grief against me, it was using me. You think silence is a shield, John? You think driving away changes anything? You carried the door open with you. You listened. You remembered. That is all we ever needed. I pressed the heels of my palms against my temples, squeezing hard, trying to force it out. Get out, I whispered. You aren't real. You're just noise, just echoes. We are what you perceive, my own voice answered, calm and reasonable, sounding exactly like the rational part of my brain I relied on for my work. We are the meaning you give to sound. You are a man who fixes things, John. You listen to structures. You interpret cracks and creaks and shifts. You are built to hear us. You are the perfect vessel. I started the car again, tires screeching as I pulled back onto the road. I needed light. I needed people. I needed noise that wasn't it. I headed straight for the city center, toward the busy squares, toward River Street where crowds of tourists walked along the cobblestones, where music poured out of bars and restaurants, where the air was thick with conversation and laughter and life. If it fed on silence and isolation, I would drown it out. I parked near the river and walked straight into the thickest crowd I could find. People bumped against me, warm and solid. Waiters called out orders. Street musicians played jazz, loud and brassy. Friends laughed loudly, their voices overlapping. It was chaos. Beautiful, wonderful, loud chaos. For a moment, it worked. The voice in my head faded, buried under the weight of hundreds of real living sounds. I leaned against the stone railing overlooking the water, gasping for breath, watching the boats move slowly along the dark surface of the river. The lights from the buildings reflected in the water, shimmering and dancing. I was safe. I was out. I was free. Then I saw her, standing across the square, near the entrance to one of the old, restored houses that now served as a museum. A small figure in a faded blue dress, hair tied back with a ribbon, standing perfectly still, staring directly at me. Clara. Not the memory, not the ghost. It looked exactly like she did in the one photograph I kept in my wallet. Pale face, big eyes, the slight smile she always wore when she was about to say something mischievous. I froze. The crowd moved around me like water around a rock, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. She lifted a hand and pointed. Not at me. At the building behind her. One of the historic homes restored and preserved, just like the lodge. Just like hundreds of buildings in this city. And then I realized the terrible truth I had missed in the warden's notes. We didn't bring them here because this place was the only source, I remembered reading. We brought them here because they were the only ones who could hear it. It wasn't bound to the land. It wasn't bound to the lodge or the orphanage or the old ward. It was bound to perception. It existed wherever there was history, wherever there were layers, wherever there were people who listened too closely, who remembered too deeply, who cared too much about what was broken and forgotten. Savannah wasn't just a city built on layers. It was a city built on a frequency. A resonance chamber of grief, memory, and time. The whole place was a beacon. The lodge wasn't the trap. The lodge was just the loudest speaker in a system that covered every square mile of the coast. I looked around the square. Really looked. Past the tourists and the bright lights and the happy chatter. I looked at the facades of the old houses, the statues in the parks, the cobblestones underfoot. I saw them everywhere, standing in doorways, standing at windows, standing just at the edge of the light. Hundreds of figures, thousands. Some looked like children, some looked like soldiers, some looked like women from 100 years ago. And every single one of them was staring at someone, targeting someone, a woman sitting on a bench, a man taking a photograph, a child holding their parent's hand. They were all listeners, people who loved history, people who restored things, people who remembered, people like me. Now you see it? The voice in my head whispered, sounding sad and tender and infinitely old. You thought you found one sick house. You found the whole hospital, John. And you were the doctor who walked in and diagnosed the disease. Clara lifted her hand again, and this time she beckoned. Come here. I turned and ran. I pushed through the crowd, ignoring the angry shouts and confused looks, sprinting back toward my truck. I threw the door open, grabbed the black book, and scrambled back out. I didn't know what I was doing, only that I couldn't keep it. I couldn't carry the map, the proof, the instruction manual for how to hear it. I ran to the edge of the river, to the stone wall where the water moved fast and dark and deep. I held the book over the railing with both hands. Don't, the voice pleaded, shifting instantly from revelation to panic. You need that, John. You need to know. We can teach you. We can make you understand everything that ever was, everything that ever happened. You will be the keeper of all memory. You will never be alone again. That's exactly why I have to let it go, I said aloud, my voice clear over the sound of the rushing water. I dropped it. It fell end over end, hitting the surface with a small wet plop that was swallowed instantly by the current. It sank fast down into the mud and silt, down where the river kept its own secrets, buried deep and dark and silent. I stood there, breathing hard, watching the spot where it had vanished. I expected the screaming, I expected the rage, I expected the ground to shake or the sky to darken. Instead, everything went quiet. Not the heavy, oppressive silence of the lodge, but a light, empty silence, like a radio station going off the air. You think this ends it? My own voice asked softly, sadly, from right behind my ear. You dropped the book, but you read it. You know the truth now. Knowledge is a vessel too, John. You can throw away the map, but you have already memorized the way. I turned back to the truck and drove. I didn't go home. I didn't go to a hotel. I drove straight out of the city, taking the highway north, leaving the oak trees and the squares and the river far behind me. I drove until the buildings stopped, until the forest changed, until the air smelled of pine and clean earth instead of humidity and rot. I drove until I reached the flat, open farmland where the history was newer, simpler, louder, with tractors and crops and open sky. I stopped at a small diner off the highway, exhausted, drained, feeling older than my 39 years. I sat at the counter and ordered coffee, my hands finally steady. The waitress smiled at me, warm and normal. No shadows in her eyes, no voices in her tone. Long drive? She asked, pouring the mug full. Too long, I said. I sat there for an hour, just listening to the clatter of dishes, the hum of the refrigerator, the conversation from the booths, normal sounds, random sounds, sounds that meant nothing but the present moment. And I realized the final lesson. Silence wasn't the answer. Isolation wasn't the answer. Fighting it only gave it shape and form. It fed on meaning. It fed on attention. It fed on the belief that the past was still alive, still waiting, still needing something from us. The only way to defeat it wasn't to be silent. It was to be present. To accept that things break, things are lost, things are forgotten, to let the dead stay dead, to let the past stay buried, to build and fix and restore, yes, But to know that a house is just wood and stone, a memory is just a thought, a voice in the dark is just wind. I paid the bill and walked back out to my truck. The night sky here was huge and clear, full of stars unobscured by branches or haze. I started the engine. I knew I couldn't go back to restoration work. Not here, not anywhere old and heavy with time. I knew that for the rest of my life, whenever I walked into an empty room, whenever I heard my name called from another room, whenever the wind made a voice-like sound, I would tense up. I would remember. I would know. It would never be completely gone. The echo remains, just like the title said. But it couldn't have me. I had made sure of that. As I pulled onto the highway, heading further north, I rolled the windows all the way down. I turned the radio up loud, finding a station playing static-free rock and roll, music that was loud, simple, and absolutely now. I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. Far behind me, on the horizon, the glow of savannah shone like a smoldering coal, beautiful and dangerous and full of things that call out after dark. Voices call my name after dark. None of them belong to the living, and I will never answer them again.